Sean Richard grew up in the Bronx, a neighborhood heavily stocked with members of organized crime. And one of the guys Richard became associated to was West Side member Angelo Prisco, who pushed Richard and a friend of his to learn a trade, such as the paper hanger trade, which they became apprentices in. By 1996, Richard's life would dramatically change. He met a young woman from New Jersey named Sarah Riggi. At the time, her last name didn't ring any bells and meant nothing to him. Not until he mentioned her father's name to Angelo Prisco. And it wasn't until then did he understand the significance of who John Riggi was. He asked Prisco if he knew him, and Prisco told him he's a friend of mine and wanted to know why he was inquiring. Richard explained that he was dating his daughter and he got her pregnant. The advice that Prisco would give him is one that many in that life would have suggested. You better go get a ring. The couple was married within the year, and the first time Richard met his future father-in-law was on a prison visit. John Riggi, the boss of the Decavalcante family, had pled guilty to federal extortion and labor charges in 1992 and was serving a 12-year sentence at the time. Riggi was running his crime family from the confines of the federal prison. Eventually, Richard started a construction company called S&S Contracting with his wife, Riggi's daughter. And by the late 90s, he shifted the focus of the business from New Jersey to New York. And through his father-in-law's connections, he had the blessing of the Lucchese family. And in no time, Richard began rubbing shoulders with Lucchese members, such as Stevie Crea, who was the family's acting boss at the time, Captains Dom Trusello and Joey Tangora, as well as soldier Joe Titello. Riggi explained to his son-in-law that the construction business was essentially a license to steal. Riggi was familiar with the business and had stated years earlier, not a nail doesn't go through a wall that we don't get a piece of. Looting union welfare and pension funds were bullet points on his resume. Alongside the Lucchese family, Richard began running companies besides his own while underbidding competitors and by using means of bribery of union officials and utilizing non-union workers. They were corrupting presidents of companies, union delegates, and shop stewards, all while pocketing 5 to 10% of these construction contracts, money that was shared with Crea, the Decavalcantes, through Richard, and Quiet Dom Cirillo, who was the West Side acting boss during that time. Crea was using Titello in these schemes, unaware of his cocaine habit and love for gambling. At some point, Titello and Richard jointly borrowed $50,000 from Crea. Titello would use $20,000 of that money to purchase breast implants for his wife, while gambling away another $10,000. Nonetheless, this was a loan that would come back to haunt him. Richard became very close to Dom Trusello and spent many a days engaged in private and personal conversations with him. Millions of dollars were being made from the construction racket, which got the attention of law enforcement. By 1999, the Manhattan DA, Robert Morgenthau, and the Organized Crime Investigative Division began investigating the mob stronghold on the construction industry in New York. They dubbed the Lucchese family's part of it as the Lucchese Group, which were involved in labor bribing, bid rigging, and anti-competitive schemes, where they used corrupt contractors to create no-show jobs for Lucchese members and associates. Crea, a principal target in the investigation, was a silent partner in Kent Building Systems, which was a modular construction company. Any contractors who wanted to do business in New York had to purchase modular units from Kent. The Manhattan DA's investigators approached Richard and broke the news to him that they'd been listening to his phone calls for over a year. More precisely, they had court-ordered wiretaps on 38 phones and 28 beepers. In addition, they raided dozens of houses and offices in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. One being in Linden, New Jersey, was the office of S&S Contracting, Richard's business. Richard made the decision to begin cooperating and agreed to wear a recording device. Meanwhile, Crea and the Lucchese's knew they were being investigated, but still needed to meet at the same time and discuss construction business, like a meeting that took place between Crea, Titello, and Richard, where they spoke at length about bribery and extortion. During this time, Korea was putting pressure on Detello to pay the $50,000 loan. During another meeting in December 1999 that took place at the actor Burt Young's restaurant, Il Buscetto, Detello and Richard met with Korea. Working at the bar that day was Joey Librano. The conversation regarded who they thought was providing law enforcement with information. Korea offered his opinion and suggested a Carpenter official. After the meeting, Richard dropped Detello off in Staten Island and then met with law enforcement where he handed over the recording device. There came a point when Detello was getting nonstop harassment from Korea over the money. When he went to his captain, Dom Trusello gave him a tongue lashing. "I told you, never borrow money from your boss." Apparently, at the same time, Korea also made threats to Detello about Richard. And Detello even warned Richard by relaying the conversation that he had with Korea, as stated in this court transcript. Detello: "Well, you were the first subject of conversation, you know?" Richard: "Yeah, of course. Bring that." Detello: "I said, no, pal. I will take care of that," and left it there. And I was walking away with him. Richard: "Yeah?" Detello: "And I shook his hand." Richard: "Yeah?" Detello: "I was the next victim." Richard: "I didn't hear you. What?" Detello: "And I shook his hand." Richard: "Yeah?" Detello: "I know I was the next victim." Richard: "Pal, of course." Detello felt that he would be the next victim. Richard had a personal relationship with Dom Trusello and was very fond of him, and naturally discussed their dilemma. But there came a point in time when he had an unnerving encounter with Trusello prior to his cooperating. Detello told him that they had to meet Trusello and picked him up with another guy in a van, an extremely unusual vehicle to go to a meeting in. But Richard was armed at the time, and when he met with Trusello, he could tell that this wasn't a scheduled meeting. Trusello looked disheveled, like he just woke up. But he looked at Richard and asked him, "What are your sins?" Richard felt heartbroken because, as mentioned, at the time he wasn't cooperating, and for him, he interpreted that question as he was mocked or being famously labeled, as the Lucchese's had a history of doing. The Organized Crime Task Force had moved Richard to a Long Island hotel prior to making any arrests on the case. In and around April of 2000, the NYPD were guarding Sean Richard around the clock. But they were soon involved in a tug-of-war over him. The FBI was running a parallel investigation on the Lucchese's, and the FBI was ultimately accused by the Joint Organized Crime Task Force of literally stealing their witness. And on September 6, 2000, the Manhattan District Attorney charged 38 union officials and contractors and Lucchese members and associates for construction racketeering schemes, which diverted millions from construction projects into the hands of the Lucchese group. The following day, September 7th, federal prosecutors unsealed indictments aimed at the Lucchese's, which included Stevie Crea. Consequently, Crea pled guilty to enterprise corruption, and in January 2004, he received a 34-month sentence. He also pled guilty to the federal charges, and both those sentences ran concurrently. Detello pled guilty to extortion in March of 2003 and was released in August of 2005, but would be rearrested again in April 2010 and pled guilty for usury, which is loan sharking, that he conducted out of his Staten Island bar, the Night Gallery. He received a sentence of 1 to 3 years. The $50,000 loan that he solely now owed Crea turned into $200,000 as a result of Crea accruing the VIG. This is despite Detello going to prison 2 different times, which is a selfish move by Crea because instead of turning the loan into a knockdown loan and letting Detello pay off the $50,000, now he owed $200,000. Of course, Detello blamed Richard for the financial mess he found himself in. Fast forward to 2016. Sean Richard moved on with his life and had been dating a woman, but that relationship soon went sideways. And the woman decided to reach out to Detello's daughter on social media and wind up revealing Richard's whereabouts, which was located in New Hampshire. Detello took this information to Crea, who is now the family's official underboss, and Crea gave him permission to pursue it. Detello wound up traveling up to New Hampshire and began laying on Richard in an alleged attempt to kill him. Fortunately for Richard, Detello never encountered him or intentionally couldn't locate him. At that point, he was doing anything in his power to keep Kriya's mind off that 200,000. A new Lucchese investigation was taking place during this time. So enter the morally unethical FBI agent Ted Otto. When Agent Otto learned that it was Richard's ex that passed along this information, what he did was typical. He seen her as a pawn piece on the board and used the woman to gain further evidence against Detello, never charging the woman. Please remember to like this video if you haven't already, as it helps with the algorithm. And for anyone who'd like to show their appreciation for videos like this, or help me keep this podcast going, you can do so by the Super Thanks icon found down below, or by the PayPal Cash App links in the video's description. Naturally, Sean Richard left New Hampshire and settled in Las Vegas. And one day gets a call from none other than Agent Otto, who tells Richard that they're going to fly down to speak with him. Otto shows up in Vegas with AUSA Hagen Scotton, and basically tells Richard that they want him to be a witness and speak about crimes that were basically decades old, crimes which the accused pled guilty to as well as served time for. Otto told Richard they would subpoena him if need be. On May 31st, 2017, the FBI arrested 19 members and associates of the Lucchese family. Joe Detello would plead guilty in 2018 to conspiracy to commit racketeering, which included the attempted murder of a witness, for which he received a 14-year sentence. Sean Richard testified at the Lucchese trial, where all the defendants were convicted and received life sentences, including Stevie Kriya, who was never able to collect that $200,000, especially since Detello passed away in February 2024.